Good morning, everyone. Today I have an interesting topic to discuss, and I have created multiple videos about the discussion at play. I thought perhaps maybe I should actually create a playlist involving the anti-pedophile videos I have created over the years, as it goes into the criminology, psychology, neurological, and medical studies that actually show objectively that pedophilia is not only not a sexual orientation, but is indeed something that cannot be rationalized. So the post that was made before you was made by some conservative, I'm guessing. Actually, I'm not even guessing, I know that for a fact. But I find this interesting. I understand that he is making the proclamation that Joe Biden is in fact a pedophile and has interworkings and inklings towards people like Jeffrey Epstein, a known sex offender that died before he could truly be convicted. Deeply problematic. Before I continue, let it be known, I met a pedophile once, somebody who actually advocated for pedophilia, and I turned him into the police, and he's still in jail to this day, which is where pedophiles belong. They belong in jail. There's no question about it in my mind, and that is a meta-ethical question that we can get into later, but I will save that conversation for some other time. And honestly, I'm tired of having that conversation because I have debunked the pedophiles' arguments time and time again, to the point where there is nothing left for me to say because all the arguments that they present have already been debunked. So there is nothing really more to say to them other than you have a mental illness and you need to seek immediate attention, and you do not have the right to impose your will on others against their own will by messing with children. They cannot give informed consent. They are not consenting adults. They have not hit puberty. It causes tremendous amounts of psychological and physical damage, and this has been documented. Anyway, so the post goes, if you think pedophilia is okay, remove yourself off my page. If you think it's a sexual orientation, please delete yourself off my page. If you think the age of consent should be lowered, please delete yourself off my page. And if you think abortion is in any way okay, please delete yourself off my page. And if you voted for Biden knowing he was okay with this BS, delete yourself, like, as soon as possible. Very interesting. There's a lot to unpack here. A lot. So, I'm not going to say who posted this, but there's several interesting things in here. First off, who on earth, other than other pedophiles, is advocating for pedophilia? Second, age of consent laws are dependent on the state, not the federal government, and this is why the legal age of consent varies from state to state, none of which are unreasonable and are based off of an age post-pubescent. Age of consent also is discluded between legal adult age. Here's an example. The age of consent might be 16, but if you are 18 and considered a legal adult, this can still land you in hot legal water. If one is still considered a minor but is legal age of consent, the 18-year-old legal adult must have the parents' consent. If parents' consent is not given, regardless of the fact that the other party is legal age of consent, but is still considered a minor of the parents' custody, the parents can pursue legal action. That's right. You are considered your parents' property until you turn the legal age of 18 to be considered a legal adult. So, even though the age of consent in the state that you live in might be 16 years old, that means you are still your parents' property, and if they tell you you cannot have a sexual relationship with an 18-year-old, that is illegal. You cannot pursue one, because you are still technically considered your parents' property or your parents' legal responsibility. Period. It's plain and simple. It's easy as that. I know this because this has been the law in the state I live in since I became aware of it when I was about 16 years old. I am 37 now for time reference. Let me put this to you another way. My biological mother married my father. She was 17 and he was 21. This was sanctioned under law because he had the consent of the parents to do so. So it was not considered illegal because the age of consent in the state in which he was married was 16. She was 17. She had the consent of the parents who signed the marriage document. Thus, it was not considered illegal. To continue on, where is it said that age is a gender to constitute calling pedophilia a sexual orientation? It is not a sexual orientation, and is why it's included in the DSM-5. Joe Biden cannot affect the age of consent laws because they are not regulated by the federal government. They are regulated by the state. Please go look it up. I'm trying to unpack this from a third position perspective to avoid the whole political team cheerleading nonsense. So this is not in support of Biden or Trump, even though both Biden and Trump both have ties to known sex offenders such as Jeffrey Epstein. This is clarifying what the actual laws are and have been for a long time. This is about fact, not political bias. Pedophilia has a criminology profile to it and cannot be rationalized via metaethics. This gets into informed consent versus uninformed consent. Two consenting adults exercising their bodily autonomy versus bodily autonomy being invaded. Pedophilic acts result in massive bodily damage and psychological trauma and cannot be rationalized. Many pedophiles eventually end up murdering one of their victims. This is not a sex act. It's an act of violence, the same as rape. This is why pedophiles usually are caught doing other strange sexual violent acts such as bestiality and necrophilia. It's not about sex. It's about dominating someone or something weaker than themselves. This has been documented in criminology, psychology, neurology, and medical studies. As far as the political aspect goes, I have no argument for it, as it is a personal prerogative of the individual. As I said, I'm not playing this political team cheerleading game, and I'll leave you with a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche. And I've left this quote on this channel many, many times. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Well, this is getting really interesting in the realm of the conservative or the Republican eye view. Let me elaborate. Republicans are special, more like special ed, and they're becoming more so as time goes on. They are becoming more indoctrinated into conspiracy theories. Where do you get this conspiracy theory that it is the general consensus that anyone is for pedophilia? I do not understand. Both people on the left and the right are in utter awe and disbelief at the amount of criminal sexual activity that has gone on amongst the rich elites. And not all of them are Jewish people, to say the least. There have been quite secular as far as the aristocracy in this country goes, and they have committed mass amounts of crimes and criminology that they have not been held accountable for. Yes, it is true there have been people on YouTube that have been apologetics to pedophiles, but that does not mean that it is the general consensus of the overwhelming populace. Seriously, who is advocating for pedophilia other than other pedophiles? And the YouTubers that have made content supporting pedophilia or being apologetic towards pedophilia have been met with much criticism, by me included. And I would have to ask the question, do you not see an overwhelming problem here? Why does this silly little Republican think that everyone on the left seems to support pedophilia? He also seems to be unaware that age of consent laws are decided by local governments and not the federal government. Each state has a different age of consent and different age of consent laws. I think the lowest age of consent in the United States is either 14 or 13, and I don't remember which state that is, but it exists. I know for a fact in Kansas, the age of consent is 16. Believe it or not, California, the age of consent is the same age as legal adult status, which is 18. I believe the age of consent in Wisconsin is 18 as well. There are other states that the age of consent is 16, other states 15. Most states usually settle around 16 or 17 years old as the legal age of consent. But as I said before, there is a big difference between age of consent and legal adult. Age of consent is different than legal adult. You can be the age of consent and still be under your parents' legal guardianship. This is why one would need the parents' permission, because a 16-year-old is still considered their parents' property. You can go look this stuff up in various state law books, and they have been around forever. In the early years of this country, people like this would have been screaming because you were expected to have kids and be married by age 15, many years ago due to high mortality rates. What I find very interesting is that the conservative attitude is to regress back to earlier years or go back to more puritanical Victorian-esque times, which I find very interesting because if you want to return to a more puritanical time, these times are when it was more socially acceptable for a 35-year-old man to take a 15-year-old virgin female as his wife. This seems contradictory, and society is becoming really stupid. The other interesting thing I find about this is the theological perspective. The Bible doesn't directly support pedophilia, but it implies it. And in some parts, is definitely pro-hebephilia and pro-incest. And if you don't know what the difference between pedophilia and hebephilia is, pedophilia is prepubescent, hebephilia is postpubescent. A 30-year-old person who desires sex with a 15-year-old is a hebephile. A 30-year-old person who desires sex with a 9-year-old is a pedophile. From a biological stance, taking science very literally, anyone 25 years of age but no lower than 13 years of age would be considered in a hebephile category, because the frontal lobe doesn't fully develop until age 25. However, naturalistically speaking, after puberty in the wild world, it's fair game. Look, the laws and regulations and restrictions surrounding sex and consent, I would say the laws are not broken. They're pretty well founded, they're pretty well documented, and they have a pretty good basis in reality, and they work. So my position on this is, why fix what isn't broken? no one really has any issue with the sex laws on the books today other than pedophilia or pedophiles. People should stop trying to fix what isn't broken and leave the age of consent laws where they stand. No one really has a problem with them unless they are a pedophile. Hebephilia isn't really as common and usually is a non-issue. The example I could give for that is the example of my dad marrying my mother when she was 17 and he was 21. Another example I could give is when I was 16, I made informed consent to date and pursue a sexual relationship as well as dump a 22-year-old person that I was dating. He cheated on me several times, so I dumped him. Technically, it was illegal if my dad had an issue with it, but he didn't, so no one cares. I would also like to say that there'd probably be a completely different story if the person was 35 years old and I was 16. This would be a completely different scenario. The scenario of me being 16 and somebody being 21 or 22 is different than being 16 and dating somebody who is 35. As I said, the frontal lobe doesn't completely or fully develop until age 25, and in my perspective, at 37, there's really not much difference between a 20-year-old and a 19-year-old. To me, they're both kids. Seriously, they're both fucking kids to me. But to me, going back to this post, there is a major cognitive disconnect. For one, the person seems to have a really hard time understanding what age of consent is versus legal age of adulthood. Being considered a legal adult is controlled by the federal government, which is 18 years of age. Age of consent laws are controlled by local state governed policies, not the feds. So Joe Biden won't be able to do anything about the age of consent laws because they're controlled by the local governments, not the federal governments. And they become increasingly more complicated as you look into them because some of the states actually include things about crossing state lines and dealing with different age of consent laws. It's very interesting, actually, and annoying if you look at it. But that aside, no one really complains about the age of consent laws as they are, so there's no need to change them. The question of abortion is a very interesting question. I could put as many facts out there about abortion as possible, all the scientific data we have on fetal development and the 3 different trimesters of fetal development. The question at hand is an ethical question. It's not a question of fact or fiction. It's an ethical one, and it's going to vary from person to person. You have Mr. Ben Shapiro that defines life at the beginning of a heartbeat, which is calculated at 1 week after insemination. You have people like me that consider life to be approximated by whether or not the thing has a central nervous system and can interpret pain. This is why the cutoff point for abortion for many people like myself would be the second trimester. It would be the end of the first trimester, the beginning of the second trimester when the central nervous system is developed. That is not to say that the fetus has any sense of cognizance or self-awareness, but it does have a central nervous system, thus can interpret pain. The central nervous system is not developed within the first week. This is how we get the ethical argument that after the first trimester, it's no longer okay to abort a fetus unless it is a dire emergency in where it is going to kill the female host, or if you're talking about something like a brain-dead baby or a Harley Quinn baby that will only live for 48 hours of agonizing pain. But you cannot, and I don't think anyone is advocating for saying, my baby is going to have Down syndrome, so therefore it must be aborted within the 3rd trimester. You will not get an abortion this way. Rightfully so. That is not a legitimate reason to abort a fetus or a baby. So the abortion argument is purely ethical, and is going to be highly opinionated from person to person. It is not allocated to fact, and you could use a theological principle. And I will make an entirely separate video on theological perspectives of using a theological argument for morality. It is a weird one at that. And it does not share the values of metaethics. I think that's about it. I hope you see the cognitive disconnect in this. They are politicizing something. They have a political agenda, and I get it. Biden's a pervert, but so is Trump. Don't be biased. Be consistent. That's the message for today, is be consistent. Don't be biased. If you're going to be against pedophilia, be against pedophilia. And don't just sweep Trump under the rug just because he's your go-to guy and you gotta be a team fucking cheerleader. As far as I'm concerned, they both suck. Tremendously. I support the idea of choices, not one's ability to impose one's will on others against their own will. And with that, I'll leave you to your thoughts.